A boy helps a lost man find his way home, only to learn that the man is his estranged father. On a misty autumn evening, Ethan trudged home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his mind wandering to unfinished homework and weekend plans. As he walked along the winding path by the woods, he noticed a figure near the old bus stop, a man looking lost and out of place. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes darted around as if he were searching for something just beyond sight. Ethan's first instinct was to walk past and keep his head down. After all, his mother had always told him to be cautious of strangers. But something about the man's expression, a mixture of confusion and quiet desperation, tugged at him. Ethan found himself stopping a few steps away and clearing his throat. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. The man looked up slowly, as if noticing Ethan for the first time. His eyes were a dull blue, shadowed with fatigue and something Ethan couldn't quite place. He nodded, almost apologetically. "I think so," he murmured. "I was trying to find my way back home, but—" He trailed off, casting a helpless glance at the unfamiliar streets. Ethan bit his lip, debating. The stranger's presence was unsettling, but there was a strange familiarity about him, a feeling that Ethan couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, he offered, "I know this area pretty well. I could help you if you want." The man looked at him, gratitude flickering in his tired gaze. He gave a small nod, and so, side by side, Ethan and the lost man began walking into the quiet streets, unaware that this simple act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. They walked side by side, their footsteps soft against the damp pavement. Ethan kept glancing over at the man, searching for some clue as to who he was or where he came from, but the stranger's expression remained distant, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The man barely spoke, yet there was a weight to his presence that made Ethan feel both uneasy and oddly intrigued. Every now and then, Ethan tried to engage him, pointing to landmarks and asking, "Does that look familiar? Or have you been down this way before?" But the man only shook his head each time, a puzzled look settling into his features as he murmured, "It's all so foggy." Ethan noticed how his companion occasionally glanced at him, a strange look of recognition flickering in his eyes before it vanished again. Though the man's clothes were worn and his face etched with lines of exhaustion, there was something familiar about him, like an echo of a forgotten memory. Ethan shook the feeling off. He couldn't place the man, so it was probably just his imagination. As they passed an old park bench near the corner of Maple Avenue, the man stopped abruptly, staring at it with an odd intensity. He reached out, his fingers tracing the worn wood as though it held some long-buried memory. Ethan watched him, curious, but didn't press for answers. Together, they moved on, the silence between them heavy yet unspoken. Ethan found himself thinking that this journey, though not far, felt strangely significant, as though he were being drawn into something deeper, a mystery just beginning to unfold. With each turn, Ethan's curiosity grew. The man's silence held a peculiar gravity, as if he were keeping secrets locked tight behind his tired eyes. After several blocks of walking in the misty evening, Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "Where do you live?" he asked, his voice tentative but eager for answers. The man paused, staring down at the cracked sidewalk as if the answer lay there. "I used to live around here," he murmured finally, his tone laced with uncertainty. His voice held a soft, fragile quality, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Ethan. "A long time ago." Ethan's pulse quickened at the man's words, though he didn't fully understand why. Something in his response sent a shiver through him, an unsettling mixture of curiosity and dread. He tried to brush it off, but the nagging thought remained. Why did this stranger feel so familiar? "So, do you remember anything else? A street name? Or maybe a building?" Ethan pressed gently, hoping to nudge more details from him. The man shook his head, rubbing his temple as though trying to clear away the fog clouding his thoughts. "It's strange," he whispered. "I feel like I'm close, but I can't quite reach it." He glanced at Ethan, his gaze holding a sorrowful intensity that made Ethan look away, uncomfortable under the weight of it. Realizing the man's memory was fragile, Ethan decided to focus on guiding him instead of pushing for answers. But even as they continued their silent journey, one question lingered in his mind, louder than the rest. Who was this man really, and why did it feel as if their paths were meant to cross? The further they walked, the more the man's demeanor began to shift. His slow, hesitant steps grew purposeful, as though the fog clouding his memory was finally beginning to clear. Ethan watched as the man's gaze lingered on certain landmarks, his eyes lighting up with flickers of recognition. I think, I think I used to come this way, the man said, almost in a whisper, his hand brushing along the rusted railing of a nearby fence. His steps quickened slightly, and Ethan had to lengthen his stride to keep up. They passed the bakery with the chipped red paint, the one Ethan's mother loved for its fresh bread, and then the old corner store where Ethan used to spend his pocket change on candy as a kid. With every step, Ethan felt an uneasy familiarity settle around him. They were moving closer to his neighborhood, to places he had known his whole life. As they turned onto his street, Ethan's heart pounded with confusion and a strange sense of foreboding. Why was this stranger, this lost man, leading him back to a place so close to home? It didn't make sense. And yet Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that something profound and unexplainable was unfolding. The man stopped suddenly, staring at the small, time-worn park near the end of the street. He stood there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan felt his chest tighten, sensing the significance of the moment, though he didn't yet understand it. This wasn't just a path to nowhere. Somehow, it was leading them both somewhere they needed to be. And deep down, Ethan knew that wherever they were headed, it would change everything. As they walked further down the street, the man's steps grew faster, his gaze darting between familiar places with a spark of recognition. Ethan watched in fascination as the man's face lit up, his previously blank expression transforming with each step. "That tree," the man muttered, stopping to touch the bark of a large oak that stood at the edge of a yard. He stared at it with such intensity that Ethan felt as if the tree itself might hold a piece of the man's past. "I used to climb that tree," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, tinged with a soft, sad nostalgia. Ethan's curiosity flared, but he remained silent, allowing the man to move through his memories at his own pace. As they continued, the man pointed to a worn iron gate and then to a small house with chipped paint and a flower bed that was now overgrown. "This was Mrs. Tillman's house," he said, almost to himself. "She used to bake cookies for us kids. They smelled like cinnamon and nutmeg." His words hung in the air, carrying a weight that left Ethan quiet. Every detail felt like a puzzle piece, small fragments of a life that had somehow brought this stranger back to the place Ethan called home. A shiver of realization ran through him as he considered that this wasn't just a walk to a random destination. They walked on, the man's face a mixture of joy and sorrow as he pointed out fragments of his childhood. And with every memory that resurfaced, Ethan felt an unshakable sense of connection growing, a feeling that this stranger might not be a stranger at all. As they approached the next block, the man slowed his pace, his gaze drifting toward the ground as if lost in thought. Then, without warning, he stopped and turned to Ethan, studying him with an expression that was almost familiar. "What's your name, son?" he asked quietly, his voice soft, yet carrying an urgency that took Ethan by surprise. "Ethan," he replied, watching the man closely, trying to read the emotions flickering across his face. There was something in the man's eyes, a kind of recognition, or maybe even a memory that had been hiding just beneath the surface. The man repeated the name, Ethan, letting it roll over his tongue as if he hadn't said it in years. For a moment, he looked away, and a small, wistful smile crept onto his face. "That's a good name, a strong name." His voice was barely a whisper, yet it held an unexpected tenderness that left Ethan feeling both comforted and unsettled. They stood there in silence, Ethan searching the man's face for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. There was something in the man's tone, the way he'd said his name, that made his heart ache with an emotion he couldn't quite name. A strange warmth spread through him, tangled with a sense of belonging and the faintest touch of sorrow. The man took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out as if to touch Ethan's shoulder. But he stopped himself at the last second. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, his voice cracking, "for helping me. I didn't realize how lost I'd been." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, sensing that this moment held far more significance than either of them could yet understand. As they continued down the quiet street, the man's shoulders slumped, as if an invisible weight had settled upon him. He seemed deep in thought, his face clouded by memories that had surfaced, unbidden and heavy. After a long silence, he cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. "Ethan," he began hesitantly, his gaze fixed on the pavement. "There's someone I left behind. Someone I loved very much." His voice trembled, carrying years of unspoken regret that seemed to hang in the air between them. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew there was a story here, a painful one, and he could feel the man's sorrow as if it were his own. He glanced up at him, sensing that this revelation held the key to the questions that had been swirling in his mind since they first met. "I made mistakes," the man continued, his tone weighed down with remorse. "I left thinking it was best, but I lost more than I ever realized." His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white as he struggled to control his emotions. "There was a boy I loved more than anything in the world. I thought, maybe one day, I'd see him again." Ethan's throat tightened as a realization began to dawn on him, a truth he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but every word this man spoke seemed to confirm what his heart already knew. The man looked at him then, his eyes filled with an anguish that seemed to pierce straight through Ethan. He took a shaky breath, his gaze softening. "If you ever have the chance," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "don't let go of the people you love." And as they stood there, Ethan knew that this lost man was somehow connected to the part of himself he'd always wondered about, the part of him that had longed for a father he'd thought he'd never know. They turned the final corner onto Ethan Street, and as they walked past the row of familiar houses, the man's steps began to falter. His gaze shifted, his face growing pale, and his eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen before: recognition, tinged with fear. Ethan pointed to his house at the end of the street. "That's my home," he said softly, noticing how the man's breathing grew shallow, as if he were on the brink of something overwhelming. The man froze, staring at the house with a look that could only be described as haunted. "Is this where you live?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, feeling a strange knot form in his chest, an unspoken understanding unfolding between them. The man took a step closer to the house, his gaze sweeping over the familiar outline of the door, the chipped paint on the windowsill, and the flower pots his mother had arranged on the porch. His hands trembled, his expression shifting between wonder and sorrow, as if he had stumbled into a dream he was terrified to wake from. As they stood there, the front door opened, and Ethan's mother appeared on the threshold. She held a basket of laundry, pausing when she noticed the two figures standing on the street. Her gaze settled on the man, and in an instant, her face turned pale. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely more than a gasp, but filled with shock and disbelief. The laundry basket slipped from her hands, the clothes spilling onto the porch as she clasped her mouth in astonishment. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched his mother's reaction. Suddenly, it all made sense, like the final piece of a long-forgotten puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just a lost man or a stranger seeking his way. This man was his father, the father he'd believed was gone forever. The world seemed to stand still as Ethan's mother stared at the man, her face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a touch of fear. Her gaze flickered between the stranger and her son, as if searching for something, some explanation that could bridge the years and the silence between them. "Daniel," she whispered again, her voice barely holding together. Her hands shook as she reached out instinctively, then stopped, pulling them back to her chest as if afraid he might vanish if she got too close. The man, Daniel, took a step forward, his own face mirroring her emotions. I'm so sorry," he managed, his voice choked with years of unsaid words. I didn't know how to come back." His voice cracked, and he swallowed, his hands trembling as he struggled to find the words. But I couldn't stay away anymore. I had to see you both. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, watching his mother's face shift from shock to pain, memories resurfacing like wounds reopened. He'd never seen her so vulnerable, so visibly shaken, and it made him feel both closer to her and helplessly distant. How? How could you? She whispered, her voice trembling. Her gaze bore into Daniel, anger and sadness colliding in her eyes. You left us? I tried to make Ethan understand, but I had no answers to give him. We were just alone. Daniel's head bowed, and the weight of his remorse hung between them like a tangible force. I know I failed you both, he murmured. I can't undo what I did. I just wanted a chance to be here, even if it's too late. A silence settled, thick and painful. And in that silence, Ethan found himself trapped between the pain of his mother's betrayal and the yearning he'd carried his whole life to know the man who was now standing, broken and lost, on their doorstep. That evening, the three of them sat in the small living room, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Ethan's mother sat across from Daniel, her posture stiff, her expression a mixture of anger, sorrow, and guarded hope. Ethan sat between them, feeling as though he were at the center of a storm, caught in a maelstrom of emotions he could barely begin to process. Why? She demanded, her voice cold but wavering. Why did you leave us, Daniel? After all these years, you show up out of nowhere and expect us to what? Pretend none of it happened. Daniel's face fell, guilt etched deeply into every line and crease. I don't expect you to forgive me, he replied quietly. I don't deserve that. I had to see you both again to try and explain. Even if you never want to see me after this, I owe you the truth. Ethan watched as his mother's expression softened, though only slightly. She folded her arms, her voice a low, pained whisper. You don't get to just show up and tell us you're sorry, Daniel. Do you have any idea what you put us through? Daniel swallowed, his eyes glistening as he nodded. I know, and I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I thought I could move on, build a life somewhere else, but I was wrong. Every single day, I regretted leaving you both. But by the time I realized it, I didn't know how to come back. I thought you'd be better off without me. Ethan felt his mother's hand squeeze his, her grip tight and trembling. For the first time, he glimpsed the pain she had hidden all these years, the loss she had carried alone. His own heart ached, torn between anger and an unexpected, cautious hope. Daniel looked at him then, his gaze pleading. Ethan, I know I don't deserve it, but I want a chance to know you if you'll let me. And as he sat there, caught between his mother's pain and his father's regret, Ethan knew he was faced with a choice that could change their lives forever. In the days that followed, Daniel stayed close, answering Ethan's questions and filling in the gaps that had haunted him for years. They met in the afternoons, sharing quiet moments where Daniel spoke of choices that had led him away and, eventually, brought him back. Sitting on the front porch one evening, Ethan looked at Daniel, curiosity mixed with lingering hurt. Why didn't you reach out? Not even a letter or a call. His voice held a sharp edge, and he could feel the resentment bubbling just beneath the surface. Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. At first, I thought it would be easier, he admitted, his voice heavy. I told myself that if I stayed away, you and your mother would have a chance to move on. I was selfish. I didn't know how to face the consequences of my choices, so I ran from them. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but managed to hold it back. Hearing Daniel admit his mistakes didn't make the hurt go away, but it did bring a strange kind of clarity. And you thought that was best for us? Daniel nodded, his face lined with regret. I know it sounds foolish now, but back then I thought it was the only way. I was afraid of what I'd see if I came back. The resentment, the disappointment. I was terrified of facing the family I'd let down. There was a rawness to Daniel's words that softened Ethan's anger, though the pain lingered. He watched his father, seeing not the mysterious stranger he had met days before, but a flawed, broken man who had lived with regret just as much as they had lived with loss. For the first time, Ethan found himself looking at his father with something resembling empathy. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps, he realized, it didn't have to define their future. If they were willing to try, maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Trust, Ethan learned, wasn't something that could be rebuilt in a day or even in a few days. But slowly, step by step, he found himself letting Daniel into his life. They began to spend time together, small moments filled with shared silences and tentative conversations. They would sit by the lake on the weekends, fishing in the early morning light, or take short walks around the neighborhood, talking about everything and nothing. Ethan noticed that Daniel didn't push. He seemed willing to take whatever Ethan was ready to give, never forcing conversations or asking for forgiveness. Instead, he waited, patiently allowing Ethan to come to him, to ask questions, to express his hurt when he needed to. And while the hurt lingered, the resentment began to fade, bit by bit. One afternoon, as they sat on a fallen log by the lake, Daniel glanced over at him, a hesitant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Your mom told me you're pretty good at soccer. She said you're fast and have a strong kick." Ethan shrugged, feeling a strange warmth at his father's interest. "I guess. I play forward." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the lake, watching the ripples spread. "You played too, right?" "In college." Daniel nodded, a spark of pride in his eyes. "Yeah, it was my passion back then. It's funny, I never thought I'd meet my son and find out he's following in my footsteps." They fell into a comfortable silence, both staring out at the water. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now, a cautious affection for this man he was beginning to know. The bond between them was fragile, built on tentative moments and unspoken understanding, but it was real. And as they sat there, Ethan realized that perhaps, against all odds, they were slowly, painfully becoming family. Ethan found himself drawn into stories he had never known, tales of his father's childhood, his youth, and the dreams he had once pursued. Daniel spoke with a quiet reverence for the past, his eyes distant as he recounted memories of his own father teaching him to fish, or the time he'd scored the winning goal for his college soccer team. One afternoon, they ventured out to an old trail on the outskirts of town, a place Daniel said he used to hike as a teenager. Ethan hadn't known about the trail, and he listened, intrigued as his father pointed out familiar landmarks, sharing stories of adventures and mischief that reminded Ethan a little of his own. As they walked, Ethan felt his anger and resentment slipping away, replaced by a feeling he couldn't quite name, a tentative connection that had nothing to do with their shared blood, but rather with the moments they were building together. Daniel was no longer a stranger. He was his father, with all his flaws and regrets, and as much as Ethan wanted to protect himself, he found he was growing attached. They reached a clearing, the view stretching out over the hills in a blanket of green and gold under the late afternoon sun. Daniel took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, and Ethan saw a look of peace settle over his face. "You know," Daniel said softly, "there was a time I didn't think I'd ever feel at home again. But coming here, spending time with you, it feels like a second chance." He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with gratitude and a cautious hope. "Thank you for that." Ethan didn't respond right away, but as he stood there beside his father, he realized that forgiveness was creeping into his heart, not as an obligation, but as a gift. Perhaps, he thought, this journey wasn't just his father's. It was theirs, and they were both walking it together, one step at a time. It took time, but Ethan found himself slowly, almost unconsciously, letting go of the bitterness that had once filled him. In forgiving Daniel, he felt a lightness he hadn't anticipated, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't just something he offered his father. It was something he offered himself, a release from the anger and resentment that had clouded his heart. One evening, after dinner, Ethan and Daniel sat on the porch under the stars. The night was quiet, and the air was cool, filled with the scent of fresh grass and blooming jasmine. Ethan looked over at Daniel, who seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Do you think things will ever be normal?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, but Daniel heard him and looked over, a gentle smile softening his face. "Normal's a funny word," Daniel replied, a faint chuckle in his voice. "I think our normal might look different from most, but maybe that's okay. I don't expect you or your mom to forget the past, but I hope we can build something new together." Ethan thought about his father's words, letting them sink in. It wasn't easy to forgive, but he knew that holding on to the past would only keep them from moving forward. For the first time, he felt the strength that came with forgiveness, a quiet resilience that gave him hope. He nodded, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. "I'd like that too," he said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, the stars twinkling above them, as Ethan felt a sense of peace settle within him. His family was still healing, still learning to trust again, but they were together, and that he realized was worth every step they had taken. In choosing forgiveness, he had given himself a gift, a chance to start fresh, to let love back into his life. And with his father beside him, he knew he was ready to take that chance. As the weeks turned into months, the fragile bonds between Ethan, his mother, and Daniel began to solidify. Trust grew slowly, nurtured by shared moments, open conversations, and the quiet resilience that had kept them all moving forward. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, lingering hurts, and conversations that ended in silence rather than resolution. But it was progress, and that they had all come to understand was enough. One Sunday afternoon, the three of them decided to walk down to the lake together. Ethan watched as his mother and Daniel shared a quiet exchange, their steps in sync as they strolled beside each other. There was a peace between them, a gentleness that hadn't been there in the beginning. They were still healing, but the weight of the past seemed to have lifted, replaced by a cautious hope. As they reached the lake's edge, Ethan skipped a stone across the water, watching it bounce 3 times before sinking. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, laughing. "You've got my technique down," he said with a proud grin. "Next time, maybe we can see who skips the farthest." Ethan smirked, rolling his eyes, but feeling a warmth he didn't mind showing. "You're on." They spent the afternoon together, talking, laughing, and simply being. There were no forced apologies or rehearsed explanations, only the natural moments that happened when people allowed themselves to move beyond the past. Ethan's heart felt full, an unfamiliar but welcome sensation. He knew that they still had work to do, still had a road ahead filled with challenges. But they were no longer strangers on separate paths. As they turned to head home, Ethan looked back at the lake, then at his mother and father walking side by side. For the first time, he felt a sense of wholeness, a sense of family that he'd always longed for, but hadn't thought possible. They weren't perfect, but they were together. And as he walked down the path toward home, Ethan realized that sometimes love was about choosing to keep going together. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. We hope you felt the power of forgiveness, the strength of family, and the beauty of second chances. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of human connection. Every like, share, and subscription helps us bring more meaningful tales your way. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.